Lady Eleanor Whitmore arrived beneath the chandeliers precisely as the orchestra began its second waltz. Though no music in England could soften the humiliation waiting beyond the ballroom doors, snow clung to the hem of her pale blue gown, melting slowly against silk embroidered with silver roses, while footmen announced her name with the solemn grandeur reserved for women of noble rank. Yet the instant she entered the glittering hall, conversation shifted like a sudden change in wind across dark water. Fans lifted, eyebrows arched, smiles sharpened into delicate instruments of cruelty. The Duchess of Pembroke lowered her jeweled spectacles and whispered behind a gloved hand, "She grows larger by the week, yet Lord Whitmore scarcely acknowledges her existence." Another woman answered softly, though not softly enough. "One does wonder whether the child truly belongs to him." Eleanor heard every syllable. She continued walking with measured elegance, refusing to allow the tremor in her chest to reach her expression. Years within London society had trained her to survive gossip with stillness. A lady who defended herself too quickly merely entertained the wolves. Nevertheless, beneath the pearls circling her throat, her pulse fluttered wildly. The ballroom blazed with candlelight reflected through crystal chandeliers suspended above polished marble floors. Young debutantes drifted through the crowd like painted swans, their laughter mingling with violin strings and the clinking of champagne glasses. Gentlemen in black tailcoats bowed with immaculate grace. Everywhere Eleanor looked, beauty flourished beside merciless judgment. At the far end of the hall stood her husband. Lord Cedric Whitmore remained near the enormous fireplace, one hand clasped behind his back while amber flames illuminated the severe angles of his face. Tall and immaculately dressed, he possessed the cold elegance of a marble sculpture carved for some forgotten cathedral. Women admired him because he spoke little. Men feared him because he noticed everything. Tonight, however, his attention never once settled upon his wife. That silence wounded Eleanor more deeply than any insult. 3 years earlier, society had celebrated their marriage as a union between beauty and influence. Eleanor remembered the softness hidden within Cedric during those early months, the rare smiles appearing only for her, the evenings spent reading beside rain-streaked windows, the careful way he once brushed a fallen curl from her cheek as though touching something sacred. Then the pregnancy had come, and with it an unbearable distance. He no longer shared breakfast with her. He no longer touched her hand. Sometimes entire days passed without more than formal greetings exchanged across endless corridors of Whitmore Manor. "Lady Whitmore," murmured an elderly countess approaching with a brittle smile, "you appear fatigued this evening." Eleanor inclined her head politely. "The child has inherited its father's stubbornness, I fear." The countess laughed, though discomfort flickered briefly across her painted features. Nobody mentioned Cedric without unease anymore. Rumors surrounded the marriage like ravens circling a battlefield. Some claimed he kept a mistress in London. Others insisted madness haunted the Whitmore bloodline. Servants whispered that certain wings within the manor remained permanently locked. As the orchestra swelled into another waltz, several couples crossed the floor. Eleanor watched them with quiet longing. Once Cedric had danced with restrained intensity, guiding her as though the world beyond his arms scarcely existed. Tonight he neither approached her nor invited another woman. He merely stood beside the fire, distant and unreadable. Then their eyes met. For one fleeting moment, something raw appeared beneath his composure. Fear perhaps. Or grief. Eleanor could not name it before he turned away. A fresh wave of whispers rippled nearby. She should not attend in her condition. Perhaps he is ashamed of her. I heard he intends to send her away after the birth. Eleanor's stomach tightened painfully. She pressed trembling fingers against the fabric covering her child, steadying herself while humiliation crept like poison through her veins. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly warm despite winter raging beyond the windows. Without warning, Cedric crossed the ballroom. Conversation faltered as he approached his wife with measured steps. Eleanor lifted her chin, uncertain whether relief or dread rose stronger within her. He stopped before her, close enough for cedar and smoke to eclipse the perfume filling the hall. "You should be resting," he said quietly. His voice remained low and controlled, yet no tenderness softened the words. "And provide society the satisfaction of believing I cannot endure one evening?" Eleanor replied. A shadow flickered across his expression. "Society requires very little encouragement toward cruelty. Then perhaps my husband ought not assist them." Silence stretched painfully between them. Around the couple, aristocrats pretended not to listen while absorbing every syllable. Cedric's jaw tightened. "You mistake caution for indifference. And you mistake silence for protection." For the briefest instant, regret darkened his eyes. Then the expression vanished beneath familiar restraint. He bowed slightly, offering the exact courtesy one might extend toward a stranger, before stepping away once more. Eleanor remained motionless while music swelled around her like rising floodwater. Something within her shifted then, not shattered entirely but weakened enough to frighten her. She suddenly understood that loneliness inside marriage possessed a peculiar brutality because it forced suffering to wear the appearance of devotion. Hours later, after the final guest departed beneath snow-covered skies, Whitmore Manor fell into uneasy quiet. Eleanor wandered the dark corridors unable to sleep, one hand resting protectively upon her stomach while candlelight trembled against ancient portraits. Somewhere ahead, a door creaked softly. She froze behind the shadows and watched Cedric disappear into the forbidden room at the corridor's end. Moments later, through heavy oaken silence, she heard his strained voice utter 5 words that drained warmth from her blood entirely. "I wish the child gone." The candle in Eleanor's hand guttered as though the manor recoiled from the confession. Beyond the windows, snow battered the glass in bursts while somewhere downstairs a clock continued striking midnight with slow solemnity. Eleanor could neither breathe nor move beneath the crushing weight of those words. Morning arrived at Whitmore Manor beneath a veil of silver fog. Yet no softness within the pale dawn could erase the memory of Cedric's words from Eleanor's mind. She had not slept. Each hour of darkness had stretched endlessly while the sentence echoed through her thoughts with merciless clarity. "I wish the child gone." By breakfast, the wound hardened into something colder than grief. The vast dining room seemed built for strangers rather than husband and wife. Rain tapped against towering windows while untouched tea cooled beside Eleanor's trembling hands. Across the mahogany table, Cedric unfolded correspondence with perfect composure, his black waistcoat immaculate despite sleepless shadows beneath his eyes. He neither mentioned the previous evening nor looked toward her rounded stomach concealed beneath velvet. At last Eleanor spoke. "You need not fear scandal any longer, my lord." Cedric glanced upward slowly. "I beg your pardon? You made your wishes clear." A flicker crossed his face. "You overheard something not intended for you." Cruelty rarely improves through explanation. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Cedric folded his letter carefully before setting it aside. "You should not distress yourself unnecessarily." The restraint within his tone struck Eleanor harder than anger might have done. She rose before tears could betray her dignity and crossed toward the doorway with measured grace. Behind her, Cedric's voice emerged. "Eleanor." She paused. For one suspended heartbeat she imagined apology waiting upon his lips. Instead he said, "The roads into London are dangerous in this weather. Remain at the manor today." Disappointment settled heavily inside her chest. How fortunate that concern survives where affection has perished. Without another word she departed. The manor carried an unusual stillness afterward, as though servants sensed fractures spreading beneath the household's polished rituals. Eleanor wandered through drawing rooms fragrant with dying roses, struggling against loneliness. Every corridor reminded her of happier seasons. Here Cedric once laughed while teaching her chess beside the library fire. Here he had kissed her gloved hand during their first winter together. Those memories now haunted the estate like ghosts unwilling to leave. Near noon, her maid Clara entered carrying a narrow white box tied with blue ribbon. "It arrived for you moments ago, my lady." Eleanor frowned. "From whom?" There was no card. Inside the box rested white roses so delicate they appeared sculpted from frost. Beneath them lay a handwritten line upon cream parchment. "For difficult mornings when courage feels terribly expensive." No signature accompanied the message. Eleanor touched the paper carefully, unsettled by the tenderness hidden within such simple words. Cedric never sent flowers. During recent months he scarcely acknowledged celebrations or anniversaries at all. Yet neither could she imagine another gentleman risking association with her amid growing scandal. By evening a second gift appeared outside her chamber door. Imported French tea wrapped beside candied violets she once confessed admiring during their courtship. Again no name accompanied the offering. The following morning brought another parcel. A tiny silver rattle. Eleanor stared at the object while unease curled steadily through her thoughts. Someone within Whitmore Manor knew intimate details no outsider should possess. More troubling still, the gifts carried unmistakable affection toward her unborn child. Downstairs, whispers multiplied among servants and visiting acquaintances alike. London newspapers had begun publishing remarks regarding the Whitmore marriage, disguising gossip beneath elegant language. At luncheon, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe remarked loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear, "Society becomes terribly forgiving when beauty disguises indiscretion." Several women laughed behind jeweled fans. Eleanor kept her spine perfectly straight despite heat rushing painfully into her cheeks. Pregnancy had already rendered her vulnerable within aristocratic circles. Cedric's distance merely confirmed every malicious suspicion surrounding her. She reached for her teacup with steady fingers. Then Lady Beatrice smiled sweetly across the table. One wonders whether Lord Whitmore intends to acknowledge the infant formally after its birth. The insult landed like a slap. Before Eleanor could answer, a deep voice interrupted the gathering. That wonder reflects poorly upon your upbringing, Lady Ashcombe. The entire room fell silent. Cedric stood near the terrace doors, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his coat from a recent arrival outside. His expression remained composed, yet something dangerous sharpened his pale eyes as he crossed toward the luncheon table. Lady Beatrice laughed nervously. "My lord, I merely meant. No soul in this kingdom shall speak my wife's name with disrespect while I still draw breath." The quiet that followed felt enormous. Even Eleanor struggled to reconcile the fierce protectiveness within his words against the cruelty she overheard outside the locked room. Cedric offered nobody further explanation. He simply pulled out Eleanor's chair before addressing her directly. "You should return home. The air here is unpleasant." For the first time in months, Eleanor glimpsed exhaustion beneath his composure, as though some private war consumed him nightly. Yet confusion only deepened her hurt. How could a man defend her reputation so fiercely while secretly wishing away their child? The carriage ride back to Whitmore Manor unfolded beneath relentless rain. Neither spoke. Cedric stared through blurred windows while Eleanor watched his gloved hands tighten occasionally against his cane. That night sleep abandoned her again. Shortly after midnight, she left her chamber and followed faint candlelight drifting through the corridor leading toward the forbidden room. The door stood slightly ajar for the first time she had ever witnessed. Her pulse quickened painfully. After a long hesitation, Eleanor stepped inside. Warm firelight illuminated the chamber softly, revealing not horrors but tenderness carefully hidden from the world. Tiny embroidered blankets rested across a velvet chair beside shelves crowded with medical books concerning childbirth and infant care. Half-finished wooden toys lay upon a desk scattered with loose papers written in Cedric's hand. Against the far wall hung an oil portrait of a dark-haired woman cradling a newborn child while sorrow lingered within her eyes. Eleanor moved closer until she recognized the woman immediately. Cedric's mother. Beneath the portrait rested a sealed envelope addressed in his handwriting. "For our child." The envelope trembled slightly within Eleanor's hands while thunder murmured beyond the manor windows like distant artillery rolling across the countryside. For several seconds she could only stare at the careful handwriting upon the cream paper. Cedric had written those words with unmistakable tenderness, each stroke deliberate, almost reverent. Nothing inside the hidden room resembled the bitterness she had expected. Everywhere she looked, evidence of preparation surrounded her quietly. Folded blankets stitched with golden thread, children's storybooks stacked beside the fireplace, tiny garments arranged with obsessive precision. The chamber felt less like a secret prison and more like a sanctuary built by a man terrified of losing something precious. "You should not be here." Cedric's voice emerged softly from the doorway behind her. Eleanor turned sharply. Candlelight cast shifting shadows across his face while rain battered the tall windows overlooking the gardens. He looked exhausted, stripped suddenly of the cold authority he wore before society. For the first time since their marriage, uncertainty lingered visibly within his expression. "You spoke of wishing our child gone," Eleanor whispered. "Yet you hide a nursery behind locked doors." Cedric closed the door carefully before answering. "I never intended for you to hear those words. But you did speak them." "Yes." The honesty struck harder than denial might have done. Eleanor placed the envelope slowly upon the desk. "Then explain it to me because I confess I no longer understand the man I married." For a long moment Cedric remained motionless. The fire crackled between them while wind howled against the ancient manor as though winter itself listened from outside. Finally he crossed toward the portrait hanging upon the far wall. "My mother died in this room." The confession settled heavily into the silence. Cedric's gaze fixed upon the painting, though his voice grew distant, almost hollow. "I was 9 years old when my brother was born. They told me childbirth was natural. Temporary suffering. A small sacrifice required for happiness." His jaw tightened visibly. "By dawn, my mother was dead and the child survived only 3 days beyond her." Eleanor's anger faltered. "She bled for hours," Cedric continued quietly. "The physicians insisted everything remained under control while servants carried bowls of red water through these corridors. I remember hearing my father praying downstairs. I remember the smell of medicine and roses. Most clearly, however, I remember my mother asking whether she would live long enough to hold her son again. The storm outside intensified suddenly, rattling the windows. Cedric rested one hand against the mantelpiece as though steadying himself against memories too heavy to bear. Afterward my father locked this room forever. Nobody spoke her name above whispers again. Pregnancy became something cursed within this house. Beautiful at first glance, perhaps, but always waiting to take someone away. Eleanor felt her throat tighten painfully. When you told me about the child, Cedric said, all I could imagine was losing you precisely as he lost her. The confession unraveled something deep inside his carefully maintained composure. Eleanor watched his shoulders tense with restrained emotion while firelight flickered across eyes darkened not by cruelty, but terror. You should have trusted me enough to speak honestly, she whispered. Cedric laughed bitterly beneath his breath. Men of my upbringing are taught many skills, Eleanor. Honesty concerning fear is rarely among them. Silence stretched again, though no longer cold. The distance between them now carried grief instead of resentment. Eleanor moved slowly toward the shelves, brushing trembling fingers across tiny garments hidden carefully from the world. You purchased these yourself? Yes. And the flowers? Cedric inclined his head once. The letters? I feared you would refuse them if you recognized my hand. Emotion surged unexpectedly through Eleanor's chest, painful in its tenderness. Every mysterious gift, every hidden kindness, had come from the very man whose words shattered her heart. She turned toward him slowly. You wounded me deeply. I know. I believed you despised this child. Cedric's expression broke then, not dramatically but with devastating quietness. God forgive me, Eleanor, I already love the child more than I can endure. The vulnerability within those words dissolved the final certainty of her anger. For months she had mistaken his distance for indifference while he drowned silently beneath terror he lacked language to express. Yet understanding did not erase the loneliness he caused. You abandoned me emotionally, she said softly. Do you know what it is to feel unwanted while carrying someone's child? Pain crossed his features instantly. Every morning I woke determined to behave differently. Every night I failed again. The fire crackled softly while rain streamed down the windows in silver ribbons. Cedric approached with careful hesitation, as though uncertain whether she would retreat from him entirely. When I said I wished the child gone, he murmured, I meant only that I wished the danger gone. The fear. The possibility of your death. His voice roughened. I would surrender every title I possess to keep you alive. Eleanor searched his face for deception and found none. Beneath the restraint, beneath the aristocratic composure drilled into him since childhood, stood a frightened man haunted by memory and powerless against love. Slowly Cedric lowered himself onto one knee before her. The movement startled Eleanor more than any grand declaration could have done. Lords did not kneel easily, especially men as proud as Cedric Whitmore. Yet there he remained beside the firelight, eyes lowered slightly while one trembling hand hovered uncertainly near her stomach. May I? He asked quietly. Tears burned unexpectedly behind Eleanor's eyes. She nodded once. Cedric rested his palm gently against the curve of her pregnancy as though touching something sacred. The instant the child shifted beneath his hand, his breath caught audibly. Wonder transformed his expression completely, softening years of sorrow within a single heartbeat. There you are, he whispered to the unborn child. Eleanor watched tears gather silently along his lashes, though none fell. The sight pierced her with terrible tenderness. This was the man she married before grief buried him alive beneath silence and fear. Then sudden pain tightened sharply through her abdomen. Eleanor gasped, instinctively gripping Cedric's shoulder. His head lifted immediately. What is it? Another violent pain struck harder than before, stealing breath from her lungs. Across Cedric's face, color drained instantly. Within moments hurried footsteps echoed outside the corridor as servants summoned the physician from downstairs. Cedric rose swiftly beside her, one arm supporting her trembling body while panic flickered openly through his composure for the first time. The doctor arrived breathless minutes later, examined Eleanor briefly beside the fire, then looked toward Cedric with grave hesitation settling across his features. My lord, he said carefully, there may be complications with the pregnancy. The physician's warning settled over Whitmore Manor like the first crack of thunder before a storm. From that evening onward, the estate changed its rhythm entirely. Servants crossed corridors in hushed silence, chandeliers burned deep into the night, and every clock seemed to strike with unusual gravity, as though time itself feared what approached within Eleanor's chamber. Cedric abandoned London without hesitation. Invitations from Parliament members remained unanswered upon his desk, while unopened correspondence accumulated beside extinguished candles in the study. He no longer cared for gossip or reputation. Each morning he appeared outside Eleanor's room before sunrise, and each evening he remained there until exhaustion forced brief sleep upon the velvet chair beside her fireplace. At first Eleanor struggled to accept the sudden tenderness. Months of loneliness had carved wounds too deep for easy healing. Yet Cedric's devotion carried none of the polished charm society admired in gentlemen. It possessed awkward sincerity instead, fragile and painfully genuine. One snowy afternoon she awoke to discover him reading quietly near the window. "You dislike poetry," she murmured weakly. "I dislike inferior poetry," Cedric replied without lifting his eyes from the book. A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips for the first time in weeks. "And yet you persist. You once said Tennyson soothed your nerves. You remembered that?" "I remember everything concerning you." The confession lingered warmly between them while snow drifted outside in pale spirals. Cedric closed the book and approached the bed carefully before adjusting the blankets around her shoulders with surprising gentleness. His hands, once distant and restrained, had become attentive to every discomfort she suffered. He noticed when pain tightened her breathing. He noticed when fear darkened her eyes. Sometimes Eleanor caught him watching her while believing she slept, his expression shadowed by helpless love. Despite the physician's efforts, the pregnancy worsened steadily. Eleanor tired easily now. Climbing stairs exhausted her. Sharp pains arrived without warning, leaving Cedric visibly shaken each time they struck. During sleepless nights he sat beside her bed reading aloud from novels or recounting stories about places he hoped to show their child someday. Beneath candlelight and winter rain, the coldness dividing them slowly dissolved into intimacy neither had believed recoverable. One evening Eleanor studied him quietly while firelight flickered across his face. "Why did you lock yourself away for so long?" Cedric remained silent for several moments. "Because fear is easiest to survive when transformed into distance. And now I fear distance more." Emotion tightened painfully within her chest. She reached toward him, and after the briefest hesitation, Cedric clasped her hand against his lips. The gesture carried more tenderness than grand declarations ever could. Days later he unlocked the forbidden room permanently. Servants watched in astonishment as furniture disappeared from storage chambers and fresh flowers filled the once haunted corridor. By evening the room no longer resembled a mausoleum for grief. Warm lamplight illuminated pale blue walls while a carved cradle rested beside the fireplace. Eleanor stood silently within the transformed nursery, overwhelmed by the care hidden in every detail. "You changed everything," she whispered. Cedric adjusted the curtains slowly. This room belonged to death long enough. Near the cradle rested a tiny music box painted with silver stars. Eleanor opened it carefully, listening as soft melody drifted through the nursery. "Our child deserves a beginning untouched by ghosts," Cedric said quietly. Tears gathered within Eleanor's eyes. "You speak as though you already know the child." "I know the child belongs to you," he answered. "That alone assures me it shall possess extraordinary courage." The sincerity in his voice shattered the final remnants of her resentment. She crossed the room slowly until only inches separated them. "You frighten me terribly," she confessed. Pain flickered across his features. "I know. I thought your silence meant absence of love." Cedric touched her cheek with trembling fingers. "No, Eleanor. It was love stripped bare by terror." She kissed him then, softly at first, before years of longing overcame restraint entirely. Cedric drew her carefully against him while snow battered the windows beyond the nursery walls. For one fragile moment the world beyond Whitmore Manor vanished completely, leaving only warmth, forgiveness, and the quiet heartbeat of hope returning at last. Then Eleanor gasped sharply against his chest. Cedric pulled back instantly. "What is it?" Pain twisted across her face with frightening intensity. One hand gripped his coat while the other pressed desperately against her stomach. "It hurts," she whispered. Another contraction struck violently enough to steal her breath. Panic transformed Cedric immediately. He guided her toward a chair while shouting for servants with a force that echoed through the manor like cannon fire. Footsteps thundered across distant corridors. Somewhere downstairs a tray shattered upon marble floors. The physician arrived within minutes, his expression darkening after only brief examination. "My lord," he said gravely, "the child is coming tonight." Outside, snowstorm winds screamed against Whitmore Manor with savage fury. Inside the nursery, Eleanor clutched Cedric's hand while another wave of agony tore through her body. Fear flooded his face openly now, stripping away every trace of aristocratic composure. Cedric knelt beside her, his forehead resting briefly against her trembling hands. "If heaven demands a life this evening," he whispered brokenly, "it shall take mine before yours." Then suddenly the lights flickered throughout the corridor as thunder shook the manor foundations. Eleanor cried out in pain while servants rushed frantically around the chamber, and the physician turned toward Cedric with alarming urgency. "My lord," he warned, "you must prepare yourself. We may not be able to save them both." Cedric's face drained of all color. For one suspended instant he seemed no longer a powerful lord commanding estates and servants but merely a terrified husband standing helpless before fate. Yet instead of collapsing beneath fear he rose and took Eleanor into his arms with desperate tenderness. Outside, the storm swallowed the world beyond Whitmore Manor, while inside the nursery labor echoed through corridors once haunted only by death. The storm raged without mercy across the English countryside while Whitmore Manor stood illuminated against the darkness like a fragile ship resisting violent seas. Snow battered the windows relentlessly, wind roared through ancient trees, and thunder rolled above the estate with terrifying authority. Inside the nursery, however, all attention narrowed toward the woman fighting for her life upon white linen sheets stained by exhaustion and pain. Eleanor's cries echoed through corridors once haunted by silence. Cedric remained beside her through every agonizing hour. The physician urged him repeatedly to wait outside as Victorian husbands traditionally did, but Cedric ignored every instruction with quiet defiance. He knelt beside Eleanor's bedside holding her trembling hands while perspiration darkened his collar and fear hollowed his features completely. The proud restraint once defining Lord Whitmore had vanished beneath desperate love. "Look at me," he whispered whenever another contraction seized her. "Do not surrender yourself to fear. Stay with me." Eleanor struggled for breath against the crushing waves of agony tearing through her body. Candlelight blurred before her eyes while the room swayed sickeningly around her. Yet each time panic threatened to consume her entirely, she found Cedric there beside her, steady and unwavering despite the terror visible within him. Hours passed without mercy. Servants moved anxiously outside the nursery carrying fresh water and clean linens while the physician's assistants exchanged grim glances near the doorway. Several times Eleanor drifted toward unconsciousness, only for Cedric's voice to pull her back again. "You once accused me of mistaking silence for protection," he murmured hoarsely against her hand. "Tonight I shall speak until dawn itself if it keeps you alive." A faint tear escaped Eleanor's lashes. "You are frightened," she whispered weakly. Cedric bowed his head briefly. Terrified. The honesty within that confession carried no shame anymore. Fear no longer transformed itself into distance between them. Instead it bound them together more fiercely than devotion ever had before. Near midnight the physician requested a private word with Cedric. Reluctantly Cedric stepped into the corridor while Eleanor drifted into exhausted stillness behind him. The moment the nursery doors closed, the physician's expression darkened. "My lord," he said carefully, "Lady Whitmore has lost considerable strength. If the child does not arrive soon, we may face an impossible decision." Cedric stared at him in silence. The physician lowered his voice further. "Should circumstances worsen, I may be forced to prioritize either mother or child." For several seconds Cedric appeared unable to breathe. Snow hurled violently against the windows at the corridor's end while servants lowered their eyes respectfully, pretending not to witness the devastation overtaking their master's face. Finally Cedric spoke. "You will save my wife." "My lord." "You will save Eleanor." The physician hesitated. "And the child?" Pain twisted visibly through Cedric's expression before he answered. "If God demands cruelty tonight, let it fall upon me rather than her." The physician nodded solemnly before returning inside the chamber. Cedric remained alone in the corridor for one terrible moment. The walls surrounding him suddenly resembled those from his childhood memories. Dim candlelight, whispered prayers, footsteps carrying bowls of crimson water. History threatened to repeat itself within the same cursed room where his mother once died. His breathing grew uneven. Then from inside the nursery came Eleanor's scream. Cedric rushed back instantly. She reached for him blindly through tears and exhaustion, her fingers clinging desperately to his coat. "Do not leave me again," she pleaded. "Never," he answered fiercely. The storm intensified toward dawn. Thunder shook the manor while labor stretched endlessly onward. Every clock within Whitmore Manor seemed to stop existing entirely beneath the weight of those terrible hours. Cedric remained beside Eleanor through all of it, speaking softly whenever pain threatened to break her spirit. He told her about the first moment he saw her at 16 standing beside rose gardens in summer sunlight. He confessed how he once rehearsed marriage proposals alone because the thought of losing her terrified him even then. He admitted he kept every letter she ever wrote hidden inside his desk. And when Eleanor trembled with fear for their child, Cedric pressed trembling kisses against her forehead and whispered, "Our child shall enter a world where it is loved beyond reason." At last, as pale morning light began bleeding faintly through storm clouds, the child arrived. A cry pierced the nursery. Sure. Fragile. Alive. Relief crashed through the room instantly. One exhausted nurse laughed softly while another crossed herself in gratitude. Cedric's knees nearly gave way beside the bed as the infant was wrapped carefully in warm blankets. "It is a daughter," the physician announced quietly. Tears flooded Eleanor's eyes. Cedric stared at the tiny child in stunned silence, as though unable to comprehend such delicate perfection existing within his hands. The infant's cries softened immediately when he touched her cheek with one trembling finger. "She has your eyes," Eleanor whispered weakly. Emotion shattered across Cedric's face completely. Years of restraint collapsed beneath that single moment. He bent over the child as though protecting a sacred flame from the cruelty of the world. Then suddenly the baby stopped crying. The silence arrived too quickly. One nurse frowned sharply before lifting the infant closer toward the candlelight. The physician moved forward at once, his expression tightening with alarming urgency. Cedric's face drained of color. "What is wrong?" The physician did not answer immediately. Eleanor struggled upright despite exhaustion while the nurses exchanged frightened glances. The child remained terribly still inside white blankets. "No," Cedric whispered. The single word broke apart in his throat. Memories flooded him violently. His mother dying in this room, his infant brother growing silent forever within candlelit arms, years spent believing happiness inevitably demanded sacrifice. Terror consumed him so completely he could scarcely remain standing. The physician carried the child toward the fireplace, working quickly while nurses hovered nearby in dreadful silence. Seconds stretched endlessly. Then Cedric heard something he would remember until death. Another cry, stronger this time. The infant inhaled sharply before wailing with furious determination against the quiet room. Relief burst through the nursery like sunlight after endless winter. One servant began weeping openly while Eleanor collapsed back against pillows in exhausted sobs. Cedric covered his face briefly with shaking hands. For several moments he could do nothing except breathe. Then the physician returned the child carefully into Eleanor's arms. Cedric knelt beside the bed, unable to contain emotion any longer. Tears slipped freely down his face while Eleanor touched his cheek gently, astonished by the vulnerability before her. Society admired Lord Whitmore because he seemed carved from stone. Yet the man beside her now looked entirely human at last. "She lives," he whispered brokenly. "So do I." At those words Cedric bowed over Eleanor's hands and wept openly against them. Not graceful tears. Not restrained sorrow. Years of buried grief poured from him with devastating force while morning light slowly entered the nursery behind falling snow. Eleanor watched him quietly, understanding at last that love had always existed beneath his silence. Fear merely imprisoned it. Weeks later winter began surrendering gradually to spring. Sunlight filled the nursery each morning now. The once forbidden room no longer carried the scent of grief and medicine but fresh flowers, warm milk and lavender oil. Servants smiled more easily throughout Whitmore Manor, relieved by laughter finally returning to corridors long overshadowed by sorrow. One quiet afternoon Eleanor stood beside the cradle holding their sleeping daughter while Cedric read near the fire. The sight before her felt almost unreal. Gone was the distant husband who hid emotion behind locked doors and suffocating silence. In his place remained a man transformed by love powerful enough to humble fear itself. Cedric looked up from his book slowly. "What troubles you?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "I was merely remembering the night I heard you behind this door." Pain flickered briefly across his expression. "I shall regret those words until my final breath," he said softly. Eleanor crossed toward him carrying the child carefully within her arms. "Then spend the remainder of your life replacing them." Cedric rose immediately before kissing both mother and daughter with reverent tenderness. "Our child," he murmured quietly, "shall never inherit silence." Outside the nursery windows snow melted beneath pale golden sunlight while somewhere downstairs the clocks of Whitmore Manor continued ticking steadily forward at last.